The inheritance was only the beginning. What happened next will stun you. Jacob had always been a man of great strength, a quiet leader in his family and community. He had always prided himself on his resilience, on being able to weather life's storms. But the disease that had slowly crept into his body shattered that image. It wasn't just the physical toll, it was the emotional suffocation. With each passing day, his strength faded. What was once a towering figure became a fragile shell of a man, his body failing him at every turn. At first, Emily, his wife of 20 years, was by his side. She held his hand through every doctor's appointment, cooked meals for him, and promised him that they would get through this together. But as the months passed, the small cracks in their relationship began to show. Emily, once his pillar of support, became distant. Jacob noticed it in the way she avoided eye contact, the way she would slip out of the house more often, the growing coldness in her touch. He tried not to pay attention to it. He told himself it was the stress, the fear, the exhaustion of caregiving. He told himself she needed space, that it was just the weight of the situation breaking her down. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. The betrayal wasn't something he could ignore forever. Grace, their daughter, had always been the quiet one. She had always kept her emotions locked away, and as a teenager she had distanced herself from the family. When she returned home after years of silence, Jacob had hoped they could mend the broken bonds. But Grace wasn't the same. She had grown colder, more distant, and the connection they once shared seemed irrevocably lost. One evening after Jacob had been bedridden for weeks, he overheard a conversation between Emily and Tom. Tom, his best friend, the man who had been like a brother to him, the man he had trusted with his life. Jacob was half asleep, his body too weak to move, but his ears were sharp. He heard the unmistakable voice of Emily, soft and tremulous. "I can't do this anymore, Tom. I can't keep pretending like everything's okay," Emily said, her voice cracking. Tom's reply was barely audible, but Jacob could hear the tension in his words. "I don't know how long I can keep lying to him. I can't look at him anymore and pretend nothing's wrong." Jacob's heart hammered in his chest. He strained to hear more, his body trembling as his mind raced. "I know," Emily whispered, her voice breaking. "I never meant for this to happen. I just wanted to feel something again. Anything. Watching him slowly die, it's suffocating me. I can't breathe, Tom. I can't be this person anymore." Tom's response was hesitant. "But Emily, what about him? What about Jacob?" "I don't know. He's not the man I married anymore, Tom. He's not. I'm not sure I even know who he is anymore. And I've been so lonely, so desperate. I don't want him to know, but I need you." There it was, the confession Jacob had feared. Emily had been having an affair with Tom. The man he had called his closest friend, the one who had been with him through thick and thin, had betrayed him in the worst possible way. His wife had sought comfort in the arms of the man who was supposed to be his brother. Jacob's chest felt like it was being crushed. He wanted to scream, to rage at the injustice of it all. He wanted to confront them, to demand answers, but his body wouldn't cooperate. He could only lie there in silence, the truth suffocating him. The next morning, Jacob could hardly look at Emily. She entered the room, her face pale and her eyes downcast. She approached him cautiously as if she feared he might explode. "Jacob," she began softly, reaching for his hand, "we need to talk." He yanked his hand away, the motion sharp and angry. "No, Emily, we don't need to talk. You've said enough already." "I didn't want this to happen. I never meant to hurt you," Emily pleaded. "I didn't want any of this, but I—" "Save it," Jacob cut her off, his voice low but filled with venom. "You didn't want this. You didn't want to hurt me. Do you really think I'm that stupid, Emily? Do you think I don't know what you've been doing behind my back? Do you think I couldn't hear the two of you last night?" Emily's face went pale, her hands trembling. "Jacob, please. I never wanted you to find out this way. I never wanted to hurt you." "You already did," Jacob spat, his voice rising with anger. "You betrayed me, Emily. You betrayed me when I needed you the most. And for what? For some fleeting moment of comfort? You couldn't even wait until I was gone before you went and screwed my best friend." Emily flinched as if the words had physically struck her. She opened her mouth to speak, but Jacob stopped her with a single word. "Don't. Just don't." The silence between them stretched for what felt like an eternity. Jacob's breath was shallow, his body racked with pain, but the emotional pain was far worse. He wanted to hit something, anything. But all he could do was stare at the woman who had promised to love him through sickness and health, the woman who had broken every promise she had ever made. "I'm sorry," Emily said, her voice barely above a whisper, "but I don't know how to fix this. I don't even know if I can fix it." "I don't care," Jacob replied coldly. "It's too late for that." Later that evening, Grace found herself standing in the doorway, watching the exchange. She had overheard parts of the argument and knew what had happened. She had always known that something was off with her mother, but this was beyond anything she had imagined. "How could you do this?" Grace asked, her voice trembling with fury. "How could you betray him like that? He's dying, and you—" She cut herself off, unable to finish the sentence. Emily turned to face her daughter, her eyes filled with guilt and regret. "Grace, I never meant for this to happen. I didn't mean to hurt anyone. But I couldn't watch him slip away like that. I couldn't." "Couldn't what?" Grace yelled, stepping forward. "Couldn't be a decent human being? Couldn't be a wife to a man who loved you? Couldn't do what you promised when you said, in sickness and in health, you think this was about you? You think this was your pain to bear?" Tears welled in Emily's eyes, but she didn't speak. She could barely meet Grace's gaze, her shame too overwhelming. Grace turned away, shaking her head in disbelief. "You're pathetic, Mom. You don't even deserve to be in this house. Just go." But Emily didn't leave. She stayed in the room, standing in the corner, broken, the weight of her betrayal settling heavily on her shoulders. Grace, meanwhile, withdrew into herself. She couldn't find the words to comfort her father, couldn't find the strength to bridge the gap between them. The love she had once felt for Emily had turned into a cold, empty void. The days stretched on, and Jacob's health continued to decline. Grace, despite everything, was the one who stayed by his side. She fed him, helped him move when he couldn't, and held his hand through the worst of his suffering. But the tension in the house was unbearable. Emily had pulled away from both of them, unable to face the fallout of her actions. Jacob, in his weakened state, had no energy to confront her again. The betrayal hung like a cloud over everything. Finally, after days of silence, Jacob spoke to Emily one last time. "I don't know if I can ever forgive you," he said, his voice barely audible. "But I don't want to die with this anger in my heart. I don't want to go out hating you." "I know," Emily said quietly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I've done." Grace, sitting nearby, didn't say a word. She didn't know if she could ever forgive her mother either. But she understood one thing: there was no undoing the past. The only thing left was to move forward, however painful that might be. Jacob passed quietly a few days later, his breath growing softer, his grip on life loosening. His last moments were peaceful, as if he had finally found a way to let go of the pain, both physical and emotional. After the funeral, Emily and Grace were left to pick up the pieces. The house was empty, but it felt heavier than ever. They would never be able to erase the scars left by the betrayal, but they had a choice. They could either live in the past, consumed by guilt and resentment, or they could try to rebuild. When Jacob's will was read, both Emily and Grace were stunned by his final request. Despite everything, he had left everything to them equally. But there was a condition. Jacob wanted his inheritance to fund a charitable foundation to help families dealing with terminal illness. He wanted a place where people could find support, comfort, and companionship. the things he had longed for during his battle with his disease. Emily and Grace, still reeling from the pain of betrayal, decided to honor Jacob's wish. They worked together, through the difficult conversations and silences, to create the foundation he had envisioned, and in doing so, they found a small measure of healing. But it was clear, Jacob's legacy wasn't just in the money he left behind. It was in the way he had taught them, through his suffering and his forgiveness, the true meaning of love, redemption, and second chances.